Hey folks, thanks for joining. I'm Matt Reardon. I'll start here. This was the satellite loop across northeastern Minnesota yesterday where we saw some intense wildfires increase in activity really through the day as the heat picked up across the northern plains and the upper Midwest, really kind of prompting the red flag warnings and then this wildfire weather and concern throughout the day. And again, just very intense on satellite north of Duluth here. These prompted evacuations. The National Guard was called, threatening structures as well. So we certainly hope to see these grow under further containment here today. Unfortunately, the same kind of weather story and the heat influencing these fires continues here today and then into tomorrow. I think relief is coming. We'll take a look at that in terms of precipitation and temperatures across the upper Midwest. But at least just looking at the satellite here this morning, it doesn't take an expert in wildfires or meteorology to tell you that there's big problems now here in northeastern Minnesota. And I think it's indicative of this kind of broader story across the upper Midwest or the northern plains where we've been dry. We're coming out of a winter where we had a lack of snowpack. We'll take a look at that. And there is this just kind of persistent drought concern where the vegetation, once that heat moves in, is that much more likely to be stressed due to that situation. If we look over the last 7 days of precipitation departures, well, we can see the upper Midwest, northeastern Minnesota, but stretching all the way down even into parts of Kentucky have been dry. Now, some of these areas were welcoming this dry stretch here to get into the fields, some very moist acres in this part of the country. But as you start inching further northwest up into the Midwest, the upper Midwest and northern plains, some of these areas here have gone from conveniently dry, I would say, to concerningly dry. So we'll have to look at that story as well. I think maybe the bigger kind of influence just for the fires that we saw yesterday was the heat, which really built in here early this week. We went up into the mid-90s, portions of the North Dakotas, but over toward the Northwoods, Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, even well into the 80s for this time of year. Very anomalously warm. That continues here today. If we just look at the National Weather Service, high temperatures up into the mid-90s again across the Dakotas, but those upper 80s well across the upper Midwest. I'm going to take this forecast from the National Weather Service, the NDFD, into tomorrow. That is Wednesday, May 14th. And we can see, unfortunately, that same kind of pattern continuing. Thursday, finally getting a cold front into the area and those temperatures coming down with that heat moving further off to the east. And then by Friday, temperatures really falling across the upper Midwest, those fire acres that we just talked about. And then over the Dakotas as well. Really, the temperature swing, I think, over the Dakotas is going to be pretty impressive this week. That area is known for it, but nonetheless, in just a few days, seeing pretty rapid temperature swings. This is best kind of exemplified if we look over at minimum temperatures here from that same National Weather Service NDFD low temperature forecast. Of course, this is for Tuesday and then Wednesday. We see that heat lingering. By Thursday, that cold front comes through and we see those low temperatures falling into the 40s across the northern plains. But I take it into Saturday morning and you're talking a potential frost across North and South Dakota with temperatures moving into the mid-30s. And then by Sunday morning, potentially looking at even a freeze here across North Dakota near Fargo and then even to parts of western Minnesota as well. Now, the good news is it should promote better firefighting weather conditions, and we'll have to watch that story as we go through the week. At least here as of this morning, looking at the all hazards map from NOAA, we can see those red flag warnings continuing here today and then perhaps on Wednesday as well. We do have a trough moving in across the western U.S., so we can see some red flag warnings here across the southwest, New Mexico, some wind advisories and wind warnings. If we look across the eastern U.S., we do have flood watches today from North Carolina all the way up into southern Pennsylvania through Virginia and Maryland as well. I do want to jump over and show you the snowpack departures. It's a map I've shown a few times this year, but highlighting again that kind of drought concern, the influence on the fire weather. The same kind of area here across the upper Midwest. Winter of late 24 into early 25, we just did not see the consistent snowfall through this portion of the country, and we know that's impact it has on hydrology. Now, some areas that did get above average, which is purple on this map, portions of the Ohio River Valley, where we saw some big events in January. We had a big lake effect snow event this year multiple times because of the trough that's kept setting up over the Hudson Bay, pumping that Arctic air over the relatively warm Great Lakes, and then portions of the interior West. But outside of that, across much of the Midwest, looking at 30 or 25-inch snowfall departures toward the negative, and that's enough to remain part of the conversation in the hydrology situation, even here in May. I think another way to visualize this, just picking on Sioux Falls, South Dakota here, started the year with a big plateau in precipitation, didn't start to pick up some more frequent precipitation events till spring, but even then they have been on the weaker side, and you can see the year-to-date typical accumulation just kind of running away from where we're at this year in 2025. I want to jump over and look at the last 24 hours of precipitation. We do still have this cutoff low. We'll take a look at that in a second. spinning over portions of Tennessee and Kentucky, and that brought kind of a wide swath of these showers to portions of the Mid-South over into the eastern U.S. This will continue here today, prompting those flood watches over portions of Virginia, Maryland, up into Pennsylvania as well. This did get some rainfall into portions of the Midwest. Some of the areas here right now have been conveniently dry for field work. The concern kind of shifts into late May from conveniently dry to concerningly dry, depending on how much precipitation that we get into a wide swath here at this point in early May. If we look over at the current radar as of this morning, that cutoff low kind of makes itself better appearing here as we see all that rainfall kind of surging in to the East Coast here, again outlining the same areas where we saw the flood watches as this morning. As the Western U.S., this trough right here, not making itself known on radar yet, but this is going to continue to be our larger story as we go through the week here this week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, for potential severe thunderstorm conversation, which we'll look at right up here in the next few slides. I do want to jump over and show you that trough. This is the 500 millibar vorticity map from the ECMWF. I'm going to make this valid. Let's do 7 a.m. Tuesday near the recording of this video. And I'm showing you 500 millibar vorticity because it's really mid-level spin in the atmosphere. And what we know about meteorology is that mid-level spin is very important in terms of developing and influencing our weather that's happening here at the ground, especially in what we call the mid-latitudes, where we're positioned here across the continental U.S. And we can see quite a bit of that vorticity here positioned over California, maybe even if you could centralize this over Lake Tahoe. We do see this weaker spin here over, again, Kentucky, Tennessee. That's our cutoff low here, prompting the showers and the weaker rainfall here over the eastern U.S. But you can see comparatively how much stronger this system is, and it's why we're going to be talking about it more as we go through the forecast here. I'm going to play this forecast forward here from the European model. Let's take this into Tuesday evening. I'm going to quickly get it into Wednesday afternoon. You can see how quickly it's translated across the higher elevation toward the continental divide. So we go into Thursday around lunchtime. This is now kicked off the higher elevation. It's into the northern plains, prompting showers and thunderstorms in this area here that will be likely on Thursday afternoon. And we'll have to see Thursday evening for potential severe thunderstorm threat developing out ahead of this in portions of northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, potentially down into Indiana and Ohio as well. We'll take a look at that from the Storm Prediction Center. And then even the effects of that trough lingering on Friday with another severe thunderstorm conversation across the Ohio River Valley. I want to jump over and show this from the ECMWF. Again, let's make this valid about the recording of this video. That is 6 a.m. Central Time. This is the 7 a.m. Forecast start from the ECMWF, and you can see that precipitation that we just saw on radar streaming across portions of the mid-Atlantic. But we're seeing that trough consolidate here. Remember, it's got to translate all the way from Lake Tahoe toward Denver. And as we go through the day today, not seeing much precipitation develop across the northern plains. But by Wednesday at lunchtime, seeing some showers here now developing across portions of Saskatchewan, toward Manitoba, eastern Montana, up into the Dakotas as well. That continues Wednesday evening. Finally, very early Thursday, we see that low pressure system finally consolidating over portions of South Dakota. Showers continuing here across the plains, moving into portions of western Iowa, Nebraska, southwestern Minnesota. Some of these areas have been very dry lately, so we'll be keeping an eye on the coverage there. That spins up further into Thursday afternoon. Better coverage across Minnesota, getting over toward those wildfire areas in northeastern part of the state, including the Northwoods in western Wisconsin, Eau Claire, getting into northeastern Iowa, and potentially watching areas here in northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, Indiana for potential severe thunderstorm development. We don't really see that signal pick up till later in the evening. So depending on where this forecast goes and how it trends, could be a later evening severe thunderstorm threat, even getting into parts of Michigan. But maybe a bigger story here is getting rainfall in some of these areas that have been very dry, potentially that line. I'm going to be watching closely where that sets up in southern Iowa and portions of Nebraska where we really need to get some precipitation into some of the areas here. So go through the day Friday, this trough slows down a bit, continues to spin across Minnesota. And it's really by Friday afternoon, this is 7 p.m. Central Time, where we keep seeing from the global models, that is the ECMWF, the Canadian model, which we don't show very often, the European model, there's even a German model as well, have been showing this consistent signature for an MCS, or a strong severe thunderstorm complex, to develop across portions of southern Illinois, maybe even into western Kentucky or western Tennessee, the Boot Heel, Missouri. So I'm keeping an eye on this area Friday evening. The Storm Prediction Center has highlighted this as well because of that model agreement. But folks in here should keep an eye on that just for some high winds and severe thunderstorm threat as we get toward the weekend this week. If we run through quickly the Storm Prediction Center, their outlooks just for the next few days. This is today on Tuesday. You can see just a marginal risk underneath some of the flood watches there going on in North Carolina. And again, a very marginal risk here over portions of the northern plains. Day 2, Talked about some of that activity getting started, showers and thunderstorms across South Dakota, North Dakota, maybe even portions of northern Nebraska. We'll keep an eye on that on Wednesday, perhaps Wednesday evening. But day 3, as that trough really starts to move east, again, located across Minnesota, that attendant severe thunderstorm threat, a wide area here from the Storm Prediction Center of slight risk through portions of Wisconsin, eastern Illinois, Indiana, getting into Ohio, and then Michigan in the overnight hours. Again, this could be something of a later threat that we'll have to keep an eye on as the details come through. And I talked about Friday, that MCS threat, that same area that I highlighted, also showing up here in the Storm Prediction Center, their day 4 outlook, all the way up into portions of central Kentucky and Tennessee as well. So we'll keep an eye on that throughout the week. Kind of prompting some of this severe thunderstorm conversation is that we're finally seeing, we haven't seen a lot of this kind of in early May and late April, but it's good moisture return, or the strong dew points in that Gulf moisture pushing up into the Midwest. What we're looking at here is the dew point forecast from the ECMWF at the surface. We can see this morning here, just kind of give you a quick rundown. We see low 60s across much of the central U.S. And in May, we're typically looking for 70s, maybe even mid 70s to get significant severe weather. Now, there's other factors that come into play. It depends how deep and how strong your trough is, where the low pressure system is, where's the cold front. There's more to it than just what number you reach in terms of your dew point, but it is a good proxy. Where is that 70-degree dew point? And it's for that reason that we highlight those in white to make it more clear where that rich Gulf moisture is. You can see the only 70-degree dew point reading as this morning down in Miami, and that's why we didn't see particularly strong risks or pretty colors from the Storm Prediction Center here as this morning. As I take this forecast into Wednesday, see those 70s starting to climb up into Arkansas. By Thursday afternoon, now climbing up towards Champaign, Indianapolis, over towards western Ohio. And that's the same reason that same area here starts to light up from the Storm Prediction Center. Even getting mid-60s into portions of Wisconsin at this point. You can see late Friday, even getting up into northern portions of Ohio here, that 70-degree dew-point reading. Not a coincidence, right? I just talked about that overnight severe thunderstorm threat because we're getting that rich tropical moisture up into the Midwest here in mid-May. So take the forecast into Friday evening. You can see that shifting further to the south, and our severe threat shifts further to the south. So we watch where this rich Gulf moisture is, but just a week's time, right? We pushed richer, deep Gulf moisture, those 70-degree dew points further up into the country. And I'm going to take this forecast forward here and kind of even take you out, spoil the next week forecast a bit as we get into Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of next week. Too early for details on this. But I always look at this, a week out in the forecast here. Are we getting that rich moisture return back up in Tuesday of next week, May 20th, or even Wednesday? Speaks to the severe thunderstorm potential maybe across this area at the midpoint of the week next week. Again, too early for details. But we're going to need that Gulf moisture before we talk about severe thunderstorms getting out into next week. We just look at the rainfall here this week. That is the 7-day forecast precipitation totals from the National Weather Service, the WPC. See healthy precipitation moving up here with multiple days of shower and thunderstorms across the northern plains. Again, this area went over dry. We just talked about wildfire threats, northeastern Minnesota. I think this is good news for some acres here that need the moisture. We talked about the same geography in the snowpack conversation. I'm concerned a bit about some of the I-states here because as this system moves through quickly, there is that severe thunderstorm threat that we just drew out in southern Illinois, portions of Indiana, Michigan, etc. But some of the models have been moving those severe storms through quickly. They've been developing them later. And I'm pretty confident that at some point later this weekend, looking at the backwards-looking precipitation totals, that we'll see some decent holes in here, some areas that missed out. Again, conveniently dry now for field work. But as we get closer and closer to June and then, of course, July, these holes become more significant in terms of the water conversation. Also closely watching Nebraska, portions of Iowa, right, for the same reason. The WPC, this forecast here, is pretty bullish on precipitation getting into central Nebraska near an inch. That includes portions of western Iowa as well. We'll have to look at that next system I just kind of alluded to next week to see how much this precipitation is getting in to the forecast at the end of the forecast period versus early this week. Because if you looked earlier, and we kind of keep an eye on these same areas here, we can see how close they are to that precipitation dividing line, at least through the system this week. Now, next week, we get down to Monday. I talked about that moisture return coming back in, better signal for precipitation, but we're further on the forecast, right? This is a 5-6 day forecast. So the details on this one are less clear at this one. So I think what we're seeing here from the WPC is next week's system, which has less confidence right now. If we jump over and look at NASA Sport estimated soil moisture deficits, again, there's some areas in here where we're looking for precipitation, certainly, despite this early May dry signal, and really across northern Illinois, central Nebraska, getting up into portions of the Dakotas, the same wildfire area even showing up in those same soil moisture deficits. North Dakota looking at good precipitation values as we go through the week this week. I do want to take this conversation into next week. I've kind of alluded to this a few times. I'll make this ECMWF trough ridge. This is 500 millibar height anomalies valid as of about, let's do right here this morning, 7 a.m. Tuesday. There's that trough that we just looked at on the 500 millibar vorticity, the relatively weaker cutoff low. I'm going to take this forecast quickly through Wednesday and Thursday, right? There's the Thursday severe thunderstorm threat that we talked about at ahead of that trough. The freezing temperatures in behind it on Saturday and Sunday across the Dakotas potentially. And then the next trough developing over that same geography across the western U.S., even kind of centered near Lake Tahoe. This is Sunday afternoon. As I take this into Monday, you can see the spinning here closer to the Four Corners region where we've seen quite a few troughs here in May. And then exiting out on Tuesday. And then moving through the northern plains, upper Midwest on late Tuesday into Wednesday. So that's where we're going to be watching that low pressure system develop and track across. We saw those 70-degree dew points returning to the Midwest, looking at certainly good precipitation chances here across a wide area of the central part of the country, perhaps even into the central plains, and then likely a severe thunderstorm conversation to be had at some point along those 70-degree dew points where we saw those develop. And I'm going to take you back quickly here, show you the ECMWF solution just for right now. I'm going to take this Friday, Saturday. We really see late Sunday potential shower and storms development out ahead of that low pressure system late Sunday night across portions of Nebraska and Kansas. Again, the exact details on this not clear yet. Getting out into Monday morning, seeing that precipitation continue across portions of eastern Kansas, Missouri, western Iowa, and then potentially redeveloping on Tuesday or Monday afternoon and then Tuesday morning. And then Tuesday afternoon really consolidating here across portions of western Iowa, potentially severe thunderstorms here across portions of Missouri and Illinois. Again, out into a 7-day forecast at this point, the exact kind of trajectory of this low pressure system, the exact rainfall details not clear yet. And we'll have to see where and which areas have the most severe thunderstorm conversation, but at least with another trough moving in, high confidence in that we'll have some sort of story or storm system to talk about as we go through the next work week. I do want to take the forecast out even a little bit further. This is going well out into the end of the next work week. We can see a little bit of a hint of a ridge here developing. This is from the ECMWF solution. We'll look at a few others in just a second, but I am keeping an eye on this as we go through the forecast period. So that trough next week moves through, likely looking at precipitation associated with that across portions of the west, the central U.S., and then finally the eastern U.S. But if a trough gives way to a ridge like later next week, we're talking about return to heat and dry conditions. We'll have to see how persistent that is. Look at the European 7-day precipitation departures. We can see, again, we talked about that healthy precipitation across the northern plains from the WPC. We see that same signal across the eastern U.S. But again, I'm concerned about some areas and pockets in here staying dry really through the forecast period toward that next trough next week. We'll have to keep an eye on which areas kind of miss out on the precipitation, whether that's central Nebraska, portions of northern Illinois, where we have those snowpack deficits, or a few other areas. We jump over and look at the ECMWF ensemble forecast. I'm taking this all the way out to the end of next work week. We see that trough that we just talked about Wednesday, May 21st. But as that leaves, right, we said we were concerned about that giving way to a ridge across the central part of the country. And we see that signal from the ECMWF ensemble. Despite that, their 8 to 14 day precipitation anomaly, that is through kind of the end of the next work week, it shows that trough moving through nicely, but behind it, right, we see those precipitation departures pick back up toward the dry side, right? So that potential ridge moving in behind that trough as it moves through the Midwest and then the eastern U.S. showing up here from the ECMWF ensemble. I'm going to jump over and show the ECMWF AIFS as just kind of another solution here. So let's jump back. We'll pull that up. 500 millibar height anomalies. Again, I'm going to take this quickly through this week. There's that trough next week we just talked about. Moves through the central part of the country. That looks consistent with our forecast. Potentially, if this solution comes through by Thursday of next week, this would be some colder weather and temperatures over portions of the Midwest. That pushes through the eastern U.S. next weekend, but even the AIFS at this point has that ridge developing behind that next trough next week. We'll have to keep an eye on this because at this point we're getting out into late May, near June. And any sort of return to ridging like this over the areas that we just talked about, right, potentially going back over dry will be of note to us. Another reason I'm kind of cautious of that is if I show you that pattern from the ECMWF, the 8 to 14 day outlook with better precipitation here over the Midwest, the upper Midwest, the eastern US, it's similar to what we've seen a few times here this May from the extended forecast from the ECMWF. If I just jump over and show you the forecast from May 20th to June 20th, that is the extended 30-day forecast for precipitation from the ECMWF. Dry in the Central Plains, dry along the Continental Divide, even into the Southern Plains, wet in the Midwest, wet in the upper Midwest. They look very similar. So this pattern that the ECMWF has been highlighting for May and then early June, kind of showing up in the long range here. And that's more of a concern, right? Less of a concern for some of the areas we talked about, maybe in northern Illinois, Wisconsin, or northern Minnesota, but concerning for portions of the Central Plains. That's why I'm watching very closely some areas here in northeastern Colorado, central or eastern Nebraska, western Iowa, Kansas, to see which areas miss out on some of these next few precipitation and thunderstorm events. I do want to talk about one last story here. This is the same AIFS forecast I showed you earlier. Now, we did see that break out into a ridge as we went through the forecast later next week. I'm going to play this forward. And I want to stop here. This is kind of Wednesday tomorrow. And what I see here, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, is a lack of momentum in the atmosphere. It's something that we've been talking about through April into May. And what I mean by that is we kind of have these large ridges, more dominant ridges. Here's one across Europe. These kind of cutoff lows. Here's one across Russia. This low pressure system and trough here across the central Atlantic. And we don't see a lot of organization to the flow, and that kind of persists even across North America here. We talked about the cutoff low here spinning across the Carolinas. So take this forecast forward. We see these kind of cutoff lows, the ridges north of them, kind of that blocking pattern continue. But as we go into next week and then take this forecast even further out into late next week, Saturday, May 24th, at least right now, I see less of those as we get further out into the forecast. In fact, I see more zonal flow. That is a more west to east orientation for the jet stream, not these huge ridges with little cutoff lows spinning underneath them. So perhaps here from the AFS, a trend toward more momentum in the atmosphere as we go through mid to late May at this point. And this has been something we've seen crop up in a few forecasts. If we jump over and look at the GFS forecast, and we're just looking at velocity potential as a kind of indicator of convection over the Western Pacific. That's an area where we can typically generate momentum in the atmosphere. And what we look at back in time on this diagram into April is we had a lack of good thunderstorm development over the Western Pacific for much of April. And it's really over that same time period where we were talking and concerned about this lack of momentum. But if we look at the forecast here from the GFS, even over the last 5 days, and then certainly over the next 15 days, I think the AFS is picking up on this well, at least in May, returning back toward a more momentum or generating pattern in the atmosphere, if you will. And that should bring more of these more faster moving troughs and ridges through. So while I'm concerned about that ridge that could develop at the end of next week, if it's short-lived, if it's 3 or 4 days, right, it just opens up another window here in mid to late May, but we'll get precipitation in behind it. And it's that kind of pattern that would have me, at least if we see it develop, less concern going into June. But we'll have to watch. If this kind of cuts off here at the end of May 22nd, 23rd, and we go right back into that lower momentum pattern into the end of May, into June, it's all for naught. But at least right now, it is something of a small but healthy signal, I think, for a better pattern going into the next month. Another way to kind of highlight this is if we look at this is the CFS forecast for severe weather setups. We've looked at this before. It can be kind of hard to read when you first see it, but what we're really looking at along this white line here is the present day. Unlike the last chart, which kind of read top to bottom, this chart reads left to right. So everything left of this white line is in the past. So these were all the severe thunderstorm events that we saw in April. And what we can really see here is that in early April, we had the flurry of severe thunderstorm events. We see April 2nd really popping up here. That was the big severe outbreak across Arkansas, portions of the Mid-South and Midwest. But we talked about that lack of momentum, right? We went through April and saw virtually nil on the severe thunderstorm department across much of the country. Finally started picking things up in the southern plains a bit with some cutoff lows as we got into late April. But even over the last kind of 10 days have been really rather quiet. But we're seeing those pick up, right? We just talked about the Thursdays showing up here, and then I talked about mid next week showing up here, and potentially more of those to come. So severe thunderstorm chances, right? Healthier precipitation signal despite the concern for wind, hail, and tornadoes. Better going forward than we see going back in time. Now we'll have to see. This is just a forecast, and it's well out into the future. Some of these chiclets here, if you will, going out into 20 and then the 30-day forecast at this point. But at least over the next 7 days, looking at healthier severe thunderstorm, and then as a result, precipitation chance. We'll have to see if that persists until late May or early June. I'll leave it there today. Thanks for watching. Eric will join with you all on Wednesday morning.